The hum of the plane's engines blended with the soft chatter of the passengers. For Sophia, a young, successful black woman in her 30s, the flight from New York to San Francisco was supposed to be the final leg of a long journey. The past few days had been a whirlwind, but now she was looking forward to reuniting with her extended family on the West Coast. Her husband, Marcus, a tall, confident man in his early 40s, sat beside her, his eyes closed as he relaxed after the stressful airport lines. In the seat next to them, their 8-year-old daughter, Amara, was lost in her little world, her fingers tracing the outline of her stuffed bear. It was a peaceful moment, until it wasn't. The flight attendant, Nancy, appeared from the front, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin as she walked down the aisle. She was older, in her 50s perhaps, with a tight bun and an air of superiority. Sophia noticed her immediately as she passed by. There was something unsettling about Nancy, something cold about the way she glanced at Sophia, almost like she was judging her. But Sophia was used to that. As a successful black woman traveling with her family, she had learned to ignore the looks and the stares. However, what happened next made it impossible to ignore. As Sophia placed her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, she noticed Nancy approaching from the corner of her eye. She wasn't surprised at first, as it was common for attendants to check the overhead bins. But when Nancy stopped in front of her, her smile was anything but kind. "That's not how you store your bag," Nancy said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're supposed to place it neatly, not just shove it in there." Sophia blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, I thought it would fit there," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. But Nancy's expression soured. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You should be more careful. People like you always seem to make these kinds of mistakes." The words stung, but Sophia took a deep breath, reminding herself that she didn't need to engage. She smiled politely and said, "It's okay, I'll adjust it." But the irritation on Nancy's face only grew, and she snapped, "No, you don't get it. You have to do it properly. Don't act like you own the place." Sophia's blood began to boil. Her patience was wearing thin, but she forced herself to remain calm. She was determined not to let Nancy get to her. The flight attendant's tone was getting sharper, more demeaning, and now she was leaning in too close for comfort. "Please step back," Sophia said, trying to defuse the situation before it escalated. But Nancy's smile turned into a scowl, her eyes cold and judgmental. "I'm just trying to help you do things right. You don't seem to know how to follow instructions," she hissed, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to overhear. Sophia's heart raced. She tried to stay composed, but Nancy's words were cutting deeper now. Then, without warning, Nancy slapped her. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed across the cabin. The entire plane seemed to go silent as everyone turned to look. The sting on Sophia's cheek was immediate, but it wasn't the pain that hurt the most. It was the humiliation. Her face flushed with anger, but she didn't want to make a scene. The other passengers were looking around, unsure of how to react, but no one stepped forward to help. Marcus, sitting quietly beside his wife, immediately stood up. His expression was unreadable, but everyone in the vicinity could sense the shift in the air. He was calm, but his presence was commanding. "What just happened?" Marcus's voice was low, but full of authority. His gaze was fixed on Nancy, who had stepped back, clearly startled by his reaction. Nancy opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Her hand hovered in the air, still twitching from the slap. The silence on the plane was suffocating. Sophia was still in shock, her hand pressed to her cheek, but her husband was no longer the calm, composed man he had been moments ago. He was seething, but he wasn't reacting impulsively. He was thinking, "Did you just slap my wife?" Marcus repeated, his voice steady, but with a razor-sharp edge that made the whole cabin hold its breath. Nancy's face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no apology came. She scoffed instead, trying to shrug off the situation. "Just a misunderstanding," she muttered, but her voice was weak, and even she knew it. Marcus stepped closer, his presence towering over her. "You should have thought twice before putting your hands on her," he said coldly. The plane was still, the air thick with tension. Every passenger was now awake, some pretending to read or look out the windows. others simply watching the drama unfold. The silence hung like a cloud, broken only by the soft hum of the engines. Marcus wasn't done yet. He stood in the aisle, his eyes locked on Nancy as she took a step back, avoiding his gaze. Her hands were wringing together in an awkward, nervous motion, but her pride wouldn't allow her to apologize. She had made a miscalculation, and now the stakes were higher than she could imagine. "Do you realize what you've just done?" Marcus's voice remained calm, but the controlled anger beneath it was unmistakable. Nancy cleared her throat, trying to compose herself. "I was just—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice cold. "You weren't just anything. You assaulted my wife in front of everyone on this flight." His eyes narrowed. "This is not a minor mistake. You've crossed a line, and you'll regret it." Nancy's face turned a shade of crimson. She glanced nervously at the other flight attendants who were now watching from the back of the cabin, unsure of what to do. She was completely out of her depth. "Look, I'm sorry, okay?" she said, but her tone was more defensive than apologetic. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Marcus wasn't just any passenger on this flight. Sophia, still stunned by the slap, slowly turned to her husband, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. Marcus caught her eye and gave her a small, reassuring nod. He was handling it. She knew that. She glanced around at the passengers who were now openly staring. Some were whispering, others just watching the interaction with a hint of curiosity. But what they didn't know was that Marcus had already made his move. Without warning, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number quickly, his expression never leaving Nancy's face. The flight attendant didn't notice the call at first, but as Marcus spoke into the phone, his tone was measured and authoritative. "Yes, I need to speak with the manager on duty at the airline immediately. It's urgent. This involves a case of assault on board one of your flights." Nancy froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The thought of airline management getting involved was the last thing she wanted. But Marcus wasn't done. "Just so you know," Marcus continued, "I also have this interaction on video." He raised his phone, casually showing her the screen. The video had been recording the entire time. The slap, the degrading comments, everything. "It's all right here, recorded in real time. I'll be sending it directly to the authorities if necessary." Nancy's face turned even paler. She could tell that Marcus wasn't bluffing. His composure wasn't that of a random passenger. It was the kind of calm confidence that came from knowing exactly what to do next and having the power to back it up. "We'll see if you still think this is a misunderstanding when this video goes viral," Marcus added, his voice a low growl that made everyone in the cabin sit a little straighter. Sophia, who had been quietly observing, now leaned in closer to Marcus. She whispered, "Are you sure about this? I just want to get to our destination safely." Marcus turned to her, his expression softening. "We're not backing down, sophomore. This isn't about the flight anymore. It's about standing up to people who think they can get away with this behavior." Sophia nodded, her heart swelling with pride. She trusted him. Meanwhile, Nancy was practically shaking. She knew she had made a grave mistake, and now she was trapped. Her mind raced for a way out, but there was none. The only thing she could do now was apologize, though deep down, she knew it wouldn't be enough. I'm really sorry," Nancy stammered, but it was too late. Her voice cracked with fear. "I didn't mean—" Marcus's eyes narrowed. "I know you didn't, but you should have thought about that before slapping my wife." There was a long pause as Marcus let the weight of his words sink in. Then he looked back down at his phone and made another call. This time, it was to someone even more important. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. Nancy stood there, awkwardly shifting on her feet, while Marcus spoke with someone on the phone in a calm, collected manner. His tone was precise, professional even, as he calmly explained the situation once again. Meanwhile, Sophia could feel her pulse quicken as her mind began to process what had just happened. The slap was one thing, harsh and degrading, but now the real battle had begun. The more Marcus spoke, the more she realized just how serious he was about seeing this through. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the other passengers were starting to take notice. Some were exchanging whispers, while others tried to look busy, pretending not to be involved. But the eyes of the whole plane were on Marcus, waiting to see what he would do next. Nancy stood behind him, silent, almost apologetic now, but there was still an air of defiance in her posture. She clearly didn't like being the center of attention. Marcus finished his phone call, his voice growing firmer. "Yes, thank you. I'll follow up with you as soon as we land." He ended the call and turned to Nancy, his face unreadable. "You've made a serious mistake, Nancy," Marcus said quietly, but his words carried weight. "This isn't just going to blow over." Nancy took a deep breath. She knew she was on the verge of losing everything, but she was stubborn. "I didn't know it was going to escalate like this." "Well, now you know," Marcus replied coolly, "and you'll have a long time to think about it." Sophia looked at her husband, a mixture of admiration and concern in her eyes. She had seen him handle high-pressure situations before, but this was different. This was personal. Nancy, clearly rattled, took a step back. She crossed her arms in a defensive posture and shot a nervous glance at the other flight attendants. But none of them stepped forward to defend her. They were all watching, just as much a part of this moment as the passengers. "I'm sorry, okay? I shouldn't have slapped you," Nancy muttered, almost too quietly to hear. But Marcus wasn't interested in apologies anymore. He was thinking beyond this flight, beyond just getting the attendant reprimanded. His mind was already on the next steps. The plane was beginning its descent, and the excitement among the passengers was palpable. Everyone could sense that something was about to happen, but only a few knew exactly what that something was. Marcus's phone buzzed again. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the screen for a moment. He looked up at Nancy and then at the flight attendants at the back of the plane. His lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. The next move was coming, and it would be epic. The plane had landed at the gate, and passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts. The lights overhead flashed from "fasten seatbelt" to "carry-on baggage," signaling the end of the flight. But Marcus was still sitting calmly, his phone in hand, his mind focused. Nancy had been silently watching, knowing something was about to happen, but she wasn't sure what. Her nerves were getting the best of her, and she couldn't stop fidgeting. Marcus stood up and began walking toward the front of the plane. As he passed by, he gave a quick nod to the captain, who gave a subtle acknowledgement in return. Then, without a word, Marcus walked toward the cockpit, where the airline staff were waiting. The pilot, a tall man in his 40s, was already speaking with the crew. But as soon as he saw Marcus approaching, his demeanor changed. The pilot had no idea what was going on, but he could tell by Marcus's composed expression that this was serious. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said quietly, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. "I need to speak with you and the management. It's urgent." The pilot nodded, gesturing for Marcus to follow him. Moments later, Marcus was in the airline's customer service office, explaining the situation to the manager. Marcus sat in the airline's customer service office, the manager across from him, taking notes. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional distant sound of passengers making their way through the terminal. "So, let me get this straight," the manager said, his voice tense as he reviewed the video on Marcus's phone. The video clearly showed Nancy's slap, the words exchanged, and the moments that had led to the confrontation. It was undeniable evidence. This woman, your flight attendant, slapped your wife for no reason? Marcus nodded, maintaining his calm demeanor. "That's correct. She struck my wife without provocation. My wife asked for assistance, and this is how she was treated. And I'm afraid this isn't the first time I've heard of something like this happening." The manager glanced at the video once more. The passengers' reactions, the way Nancy handled the situation, it all painted a damning picture. But even more damning was the fact that Marcus was a high-profile businessman, well known in the industry. This wasn't a simple customer complaint. This was the kind of incident that could cause a major public relations disaster if not handled carefully. Marcus leaned forward, his tone becoming even more serious. "I'm not looking for just an apology. I want the full accountability of your staff, especially Nancy. She's put not only my wife in harm's way, but also violated the trust of everyone aboard that flight." The manager was taken aback, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "Of course, sir. I'll make sure this is handled appropriately. We'll start an internal investigation right away." Marcus wasn't satisfied with just an investigation. That's not enough. I want to remove from the flight immediately. And I'll be making sure this story gets to the right people. This behavior will not be tolerated. The manager nodded solemnly, understanding the implications. I'll take care of it immediately. As the conversation wrapped up, Marcus's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. It was from his lawyer. The final details were set in motion. Back on the plane, Sophia had been anxiously waiting. She was aware of the brewing storm, but now she felt a sense of relief. Marcus was taking control, and it seemed like things were moving in the right direction. Her mind raced, recalling the events that had unfolded so quickly. Meanwhile, Nancy stood awkwardly in the back of the plane, watching the flight attendants prepare for the disembarkation. She was nervous, wondering how this would all play out. She had tried to brush off the confrontation earlier, but now reality was setting in. She couldn't escape the consequences. As Marcus walked back toward the gate, he glanced at Nancy one more time. His eyes were steely with determination. The conversation was far from over, and this wasn't just about one incident. It was about a message. The message that racial discrimination, disrespect, and violence would not be tolerated. Nancy, feeling the weight of her actions, approached the counter. Her steps were slow, and she couldn't avoid the stares of the passengers as they began to exit. The flight crew was already acting as though nothing had happened, but Nancy knew that her time with the airline was numbered. When Marcus arrived at the gate, the airline manager was already there, waiting for him. They exchanged a brief handshake, and then the manager turned to face Nancy, who had just arrived at the desk. "I'm afraid, Ms. Wood, your services are no longer required. We've reviewed the incident, and we have made the decision to terminate your employment," the manager said, his voice firm but compassionate. Nancy's face drained of color. She had heard the rumors of flight attendants losing their jobs for misconduct, but she had never expected it to happen to her. She opened her mouth to protest, but the manager continued. "Please gather your things and exit the aircraft. Someone will escort you to your luggage, and you will be provided with a flight back to your home city. We'll also ensure your final paycheck is processed." The manager didn't wait for a response, turning to address the other flight attendants. "Please make sure she has everything she needs. Thank you for your cooperation." Nancy stood there, stunned, for a moment before she slowly gathered her things. The reality of the situation hit her all at once. Her actions, her words, her arrogance, all had led to this moment. She was out of a job, her reputation tarnished. As she exited the plane, she looked back at Marcus, who was still standing at the gate. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint in his eyes. He wasn't gloating. No, this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Sophia stood next to Marcus, her hand lightly resting on his arm. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She knew Marcus had handled the situation the way he always did, with control, with authority, and with an unwavering sense of justice. When Nancy had walked off the plane, Marcus turned to the manager. "Make sure this gets communicated to your team, especially those who need to understand the consequences of their actions. This is a lesson they'll all remember." The manager nodded. "It will be handled with the utmost seriousness." As the couple made their way to the baggage claim area, they both felt a sense of relief wash over them. The incident was far from over, but they had won this battle. And the lessons, they knew, would echo far beyond this plane. Days later, the news spread rapidly. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about how Marcus stood up for his wife, his family, and what was right. The story went viral, sparking praise for Marcus' composure and condemning Nancy's actions. The message was clear: disrespect and injustice would not be tolerated. For Marcus and Sophia, the ordeal was over, but the impact was lasting. They knew the fight for fairness was ongoing, but this felt like a significant victory. As they left the airport, their hearts were light, knowing they had made a difference by standing up for what was right.